Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The sun had barely risen over the coastal town of Ensenada, Mexico, casting golden light across the waves that drew surfers from around the world to Baja California's rugged Pacific shores. It was late April 2024, and 3 friends had arrived with nothing but adventure in their hearts, boards strapped to their truck, and dreams of riding the perfect wave. They had no way of knowing that this trip would end not in triumph or laughter, but in a tragedy so profound it would echo across continents and devastate families thousands of miles away. Jake Robinson was 30 years old, a doctor from Perth, Australia, whose dedication to healing others was matched only by his passion for the ocean. His older brother, Callum Robinson, 33, towered at 6 feet 4 inches and had built a life playing professional lacrosse in the United States, where he had settled in San Diego after a standout college career at Stevenson University in Maryland. Their American companion, Jack Carter Road, 30, was also a San Diego resident, engaged to be married that coming August to his fiancée, Natalie Wirtz. Carter had founded his own apparel company and worked in technology services, but like the Robinson brothers, his true love was the sea. The 3 men were experienced surfers who had visited Baja California before, drawn repeatedly to its pristine coastline and legendary breaks. They arrived in Mexico on April 26th, driving a white Chevrolet Colorado pickup truck with California plates, the vehicle packed with camping gear, surfboards, and the simple supplies needed for a few days of freedom beneath the stars. Callum, ever the social documenter, began posting photographs on social media almost immediately. There they were, grinning over roadside tacos, relaxing in jacuzzis, sharing cold beers as the sun set over the horizon. The images captured a kind of joy that felt eternal, the carefree spirit of friends embracing life at its fullest. But then, abruptly, the post stopped. The digital trail went cold. The 3 men had planned to check into an Airbnb in Rosarito on April 27th, but they never arrived. Concerned messages went unanswered. Phone calls rang endlessly into the void. By April 29th, family members thousands of miles away felt the first stirrings of dread, and Mexican authorities were notified that 3 foreign tourists had vanished without a trace. What no one yet knew was that on the same day the men were expected in Rosarito, they had been spotted at a beach near Ensenada by a group of locals. Among those who noticed them was a 23-year-old woman named Ari Giselle. She was there with her boyfriend, a man known by the street nickname El Cacas, a colloquial term for quesadilla. His given name was Jesus Gerardo, and he moved in circles where opportunities were seized without regard for consequence or morality. As the 3 surfers loaded their gear and prepared to head to their remote camping spot near Santo Tomas, Ari Giselle's attention was drawn to something specific about their vehicle. The tires. They were good tires, the kind that would fetch value, the kind that could be removed and used elsewhere. In that moment, a terrible and mundane desire took root. Giselle turned to her boyfriend and made a simple but devastating request. She wanted those tires. She wanted a good phone too. "Bring me a good phone and good tires for my pickup truck," she reportedly told Jesus Gerardo. It was a statement that set a chain of events into unstoppable motion. After Giselle was dropped off at her home, Jesus Gerardo did not let the opportunity slip away. He enlisted 2 other men, Ireneo Francisco and Angel Jesus, and together the 3 of them followed the surfers as they made their way to the isolated camping area where they planned to spend the night. The Robinson brothers and Carter Road likely had no idea they were being trailed. They set up their tent beneath the open sky, surrounded by the raw beauty of Baja California's wilderness, the sound of the ocean a constant, soothing presence in the distance. They were far from the tourist bustle of Ensenada, in a place where solitude and nature intertwined. It should have been paradise. Instead, it became the setting for a nightmare. The group Ari moved in comprised men hardened by struggle and the temptations of easy wealth. Gerardo, along with Ireneo Francisco and Angel Jesus, known among locals by their street names, began watching the surfers, tracing them from beach to camp, studying their routines. Ari's suggestion became a directive. The opportunity was there, and they would seize it. As the sun dipped and the surfers reveled in the last lingering glow, the men struck. They waited for the quiet, the hour when confidence wanes and vigilance is easily lulled by fatigue. With Ari having already been dropped at home, her role was indirect but pivotal. The subsequent movement would carry the force of her wish into the world. Jake, Callum, and Carter were confronted near their camping spot, their laughter and unwinding stilled by the threat that suddenly loomed. The men demanded their belongings, the phones, cash, prized vehicle tires. But fear is unpredictable, and violence, once summoned, rarely obeys restraint. In what began as a robbery designed for quick gain, chaos flared. Gunshots shattered the night. 3 gunshots shattered the stillness of the night. Jake Robinson, Callum Robinson, and Jack Carter Road were each shot in the head. The killings were execution style, cold and efficient. The men who had come to Mexico seeking adventure and the thrill of the surf were now lifeless, their dreams extinguished in an instant. The attackers did not simply leave the bodies where they fell. In a grotesque effort to conceal their crime, they dragged the 3 men to a remote location approximately 4 miles from the campsite. There, hidden from view, was a deep well, its shaft plunging 50 feet into darkness. One by one, the bodies of Jake, Callum, and Carter were thrown into the abyss. The well, it would later be discovered, already contained another body, a victim of an unrelated crime who had been there far longer. The surfers joined that forgotten soul in the depths, their presence unknown to the world above. Back at the campsite, the attackers attempted to erase evidence of what had occurred. The white Chevrolet Colorado was set ablaze, its metal frame charred and twisted, the tires they had coveted now melted and useless. The tent where the men had planned to sleep remained standing, a haunting testament to interrupted lives. In the days that followed, as the families of the missing men grew increasingly frantic, Mexican authorities launched a massive search operation. The FBI joined the effort, recognizing that American and Australian citizens had vanished on foreign soil. Tips began to trickle in, and investigators scoured the area around Ensenada, following every lead, checking every remote trail. On May 1st, for days after the men were last seen, a routine police patrol in Ensenada made a critical breakthrough. Officers stopped a young woman who behaved suspiciously when approached. As they drew near, she attempted to flee, tossing aside a bag that contained 100 grams of drugs. Her name was Ari Giselle, and when officers searched her, they discovered something even more damning than the drugs. In her possession was a mobile phone that belonged to one of the missing surfers. Giselle was taken into custody, and under interrogation, a story began to emerge. At first, she cooperated with authorities, providing information that would prove instrumental in solving the case. She told police that on April 28th, the day after the surfers disappeared, her boyfriend Jesus Gerardo had arrived at her home with an unsettling confession. He told her he had harmed 3 foreigners, using a slang term that translated roughly to gringos. When she pressed him for details, asking what he meant, he did not equivocate. "I killed them," he said. Jesus Gerardo then led Giselle outside to show her his vehicle. Mounted on the truck were new tires, the very tires that had been on the surfer's white Chevrolet. It was the proof of what she had set into motion, the physical manifestation of her casual request days earlier. Shaken, Giselle fled to her mother's house, but she took with her the phones that belonged to the murdered men. When investigators turned on one of those devices, it pinged a nearby cell tower, leading them directly to her. On May 3rd, 2 days after Giselle's arrest, searchers made the grim discovery. Guided by information Giselle had provided, authorities located the well near Santo Tomas. Peering into its depths, they found the bodies of Jake Robinson, Callum Robinson, and Jack Carter Road. Each had been shot in the head. The victims' families, who had traveled to Mexico to assist in the search, were brought to identify their loved ones. The confirmation came not through genetic testing, but through the immediate, heartbreaking recognition of parents who knew their children, of a fiancé who would never walk down the aisle. Jesus Gerardo, Ireneo Francisco, and Angel Jesus were arrested and charged with aggravated homicide, aggravated robbery, violent robbery, and grand theft auto. The case against them was built on the testimony of 35 witnesses, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and the critical information provided by Ari Giselle, who had become the prosecution's star witness. She testified in court about her boyfriend's confession, about the tires on his truck, about the casual brutality with which he had described the murders. But Giselle's role was not that of an innocent bystander. Prosecutors argued that she had instigated the entire violent episode. It was her desire for the tires, her request to her boyfriend, that had set the wheels of tragedy in motion. She had spotted the surfers at the beach, admired their vehicle, and made a demand that her boyfriend interpreted as permission to act. Even though she was not present at the campsite when the murders occurred, her words had been the catalyst. In the months that followed, the legal proceedings unfolded in the Mexican city of Ensenada. The three men accused of carrying out the killings rejected plea deals that would have seen them imprisoned for between 47 and 52 years each. Instead, they chose to face trial, and the prosecutor requested sentences of 210 years for each defendant, a staggering total that reflected the heinous nature of their crimes and the multiple charges they faced. A trial date was set, though the men had not yet entered formal pleas. Ari Giselle, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. She was charged not with murder, but with inciting a violent robbery, a recognition of her role in setting the crime into motion without directly participating in the killings. Initially, she too was offered a plea deal that included a 20-year sentence, but the matter was adjourned as negotiations continued. On November 19, 2025, Giselle stood before a judge in a Mexican courtroom. The parents of Jake and Callum Robinson addressed her via video link from Australia, their voices heavy with grief. Martin Robinson, the brother's father, spoke with a kind of bewildered anguish. "I could never understand why you had to rob these young men," he said, the question hanging in the air without answer. Deborah Robinson, their mother, described the unbearable silence that now filled their home. "The grief is constant," she said. "We were proud of them because they were kind, generous, compassionate, and happy. We dreamed of seeing them grow older, of having children. That's all taken now. We live with their absence." When it was Giselle's turn to speak, she addressed the court in English. Her voice, according to those present, carried a note of remorse. She said she had lost her own family because of her role in the crime, that she was sorry, though she acknowledged there was nothing she could say that would ease the pain of the families whose lives had been shattered. The judge, weighing the evidence and the testimony, sentenced her to 20 years in prison. 14 years were for her connection to the violent robbery of the vehicle, and an additional 6 years for a separate violent robbery charge. She became the first person sentenced in connection with the murders of the three surfers. The case sent shockwaves through communities on opposite sides of the world. In Perth, Australia, where Jake and Callum had grown up, tributes poured in for the brothers who had been truly loved and affected many people's lives. Their parents spoke of their sons' academic and sporting achievements, their admiration for the choices the young men had made. "Please live bigger, shine brighter, and love harder" in their memory. Martin Robinson urged in a statement that captured both his devastation and his determination to honor his sons. In San Diego, friends and colleagues mourned Carter Road, remembering his entrepreneurial spirit, his warmth, and the life he had been building with his fiancée. Callum's former lacrosse coach, Paul Canabine, spoke of the loyalty that defined him. "Once you were his friend, you were friends for life," he said, a sentiment that resonated with everyone who had known the towering athlete with the generous heart. The tragedy also cast a harsh light on the dangers that persist in parts of Mexico, even in regions popular with tourists. Baja California, with its stunning beaches and world-class surf breaks, has long drawn adventurers from around the globe. But it is also a place where organized crime and violence simmer beneath the surface, where a moment of greed can escalate into irreversible horror. The case of the three surfers became a cautionary tale, a reminder that beauty and danger often exist side by side. As the legal proceedings continued, authorities revealed they were still searching for a fourth suspect believed to be connected to the shootings. The investigation remained active, the pursuit of justice ongoing. For the families of Jake Robinson, Callum Robinson, and Jack Carter Road, no sentence could ever restore what was lost. No courtroom verdict could bring back the sons, the brother, the fiancé who had been stolen from them. They were left with photographs, memories, and the unbearable weight of absence. In their homes, the silence was deafening. The future they had imagined, filled with grandchildren and milestones, and the simple joy of watching their loved ones grow older, had been erased in a single night of violence. Ari Giselle, sitting in a Mexican prison cell, would have 20 years to contemplate the consequences of her words. A passing desire for tires and a phone had metastasized into a crime that claimed 3 innocent lives and destroyed countless others. Her boyfriend and his accomplices, facing the possibility of spending the rest of their lives behind bars, would answer for the murders they committed. But for the families left behind, the questions would linger. Why? How could something so senseless happen to people so full of life and promise? The well near Santo Tomas, where the bodies were discovered, stands as a silent monument to a tragedy that never should have occurred. It is a place where dreams drowned in darkness, where the laughter of friends was silenced forever. The waves continue to crash along the Baja California coast, indifferent to the grief that now stains its shores. Surfers still come, drawn by the same beauty that once called to Jake, Callum, and Carter. But for those who knew the 3 men, the ocean will never sound quite the same. Every wave carries an echo of loss, a reminder that life is fragile, and that evil can strike without warning, transforming a paradise into a grave. Story 2. The Alsace region of northeastern France is a place of gentle rolling hills, dense forests, and quiet villages where everyone knows their neighbors. It is the kind of landscape where ancient church spires rise above half-timbered houses, and narrow roads wind through valleys thick with pine and oak trees. In the autumn of 2023, as the leaves began to turn gold and the air grew crisp, this peaceful corner of France became the setting for a mystery that would grip the nation and haunt a family for more than a year. Lena Delsarte was 15 years old, a girl on the cusp of adulthood with her entire life stretching before her. Born on August 10, 2008, she had grown into a bright young woman with blonde hair and light green eyes, standing about 160 centimeters tall. She lived with her family in the small hamlet of Champigny, part of the commune of Plain, a rural area in the Bas-Rhin department of Alsace. Her mother worked as a nurse, and the family was close-knit, the kind of people who looked out for one another and valued the quiet rhythms of small-town life. That summer, Lena had completed her brevet, the French national diploma that marks the end of middle school education. She had passed in July 2023 and was preparing to begin a professional training program, a CAP in personal assistance, at an establishment near Saint-Blaise-la-Roche. It was a practical choice, one that would give her skills and open doors to a career helping others. She was also in a relationship with a young man named Tao, who was 19 years old and lived in Strasbourg, about an hour away by train. The two had been together for about a year, and though their relationship had its ups and downs, they remained close. On the morning of Saturday, September 23, 2023, Lena woke with plans to spend the day with Tao. She dressed carefully, choosing a gray dress, a white jacket, and white Converse shoes. At around 11 in the morning, she said goodbye to her mother and set off on foot toward the train station at Saint-Blaise-la-Roche, a small facility in the hamlet of Patay. The walk was approximately 3 kilometers, a route she had likely taken before. It was a beautiful autumn day, and the roads were quiet. That morning, Lena walking along the small road that led toward the station. At 11:22, her mobile phone made its final signal. After that, there was only silence. When Tao arrived at the train station in Strasbourg, and Lena did not appear, he grew concerned. He tried calling her, but there was no answer. Eventually, he contacted Lena's mother, and a terrible fear began to take hold. Surveillance cameras at the St. Blaise-la-Roche station were reviewed. The footage showed clearly that Lena had never arrived. She had vanished somewhere along that 3-kilometer stretch of road, in the space of a few minutes, in broad daylight. Her mother, realizing something was desperately wrong, immediately contacted the authorities. By Saturday afternoon, a search notice had been issued by the gendarmerie, and an investigation into a disturbing disappearance was opened. The gendarmerie launched an intensive search operation. Officers combed the area around St. Blaise-la-Roche, examining every possible route Lena might have taken. Dog teams were deployed, their handlers guiding them through the forests and fields, searching for any trace of the missing girl. Helicopters and drones flew over the region, their cameras sweeping across the landscape. 2 bodies of water near the village were searched by 7 divers, who descended into the cold depths looking for signs of tragedy. But no trace of Lena was found. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. The investigation expanded rapidly. 80 police officers conducted sweeps of the area on Thursday, September 28th. Investigators examined Lena's phone records, her social media accounts, and her personal life, looking for any clue that might explain her disappearance. They spoke with her boyfriend Tao, analyzing the last video she had allegedly sent him before vanishing. Tao later revealed to the magazine Nouveau Detective that he had been subjected to threats and accusations from members of the public who believed he was somehow involved. But the police found no evidence linking him to her disappearance. As the weeks turned into months, Lena's family was left in a state of unbearable limbo. Her mother, speaking to the press, described the agony of not knowing what had happened to her daughter. She said that around 11:20, Lena had sent a message to her boyfriend, and that was the last contact they had. She spoke of the torture of no longer having her child close, of the great pain that consumed her every day. The public prosecutor of Saverne, Aline Claret, stated that Lena did not fit the profile of a runaway. There were no family problems, no banking activity on her account after the disappearance, nothing to suggest she had left voluntarily. Disturbing details began to emerge. Lena's cousin Luan told that Lena had confided in her about receiving death threats in the period before she vanished. Luan claimed that Lena had said someone was threatening to harm her and her family, that they were going to come into her house and get her. It was a chilling revelation that raised the possibility that Lena's disappearance was not random but targeted. Reports also surfaced that Lena had filed complaints of assault in the years before she went missing, though the details of these claims were not fully disclosed. For 10 months, the case remained a mystery. Investigators pursued hundreds of leads, interviewed countless witnesses, and searched vast areas of the Alsace countryside, but Lena was nowhere to be found. Then, in late July 2024, a breakthrough came that would transform the investigation from a missing person case into a murder inquiry. On July 26, 2024, the public prosecutor of Strasbourg made a stunning announcement. The genetic fingerprint of Lena Delsarte had been identified inside a Ford Puma, a vehicle that had been impounded months earlier. Her DNA was found on the seat belt in the right rear seat, and, even more significantly, her handbag was discovered in the glove compartment. The vehicle had been registered in Germany, but had been stolen. It had been involved in an accident in January 2024 in the Aude department, when the driver had crashed while trying to escape a customs check. The driver of the vehicle had been identified at the time of the accident as Samuel Gonin, a 43-year-old man from Besançon, a city in eastern France. He had been arrested and sentenced to 15 months in prison, suspended, for the incident, but no connection to Lena's disappearance had been made at that time. Now, however, investigators began to examine Ganin more closely. Analysis of the vehicle's GPS data revealed that it had been geolocated near the scene of Lena's disappearance on September 23, 2023, at precisely the time she vanished. The car had also been tracked to a gas station in the Dew Department 2 days before her disappearance. Samuel Ganin was a former carpentry teacher at the St. Joseph Vocational High School in Besançon, but his past was far darker than his profession suggested. Investigators discovered that he had previously attacked 2 women, a history of violence that made him an immediate suspect in Lena's case. But before police could question him about his connection to the missing teenager, Samuel Ganin made a decision that would ensure the full truth of what happened to Lena would never be known. On July 10, 2024, just weeks before the connection between his vehicle and Lena's DNA was established, Samuel Ganin was found dead in his cell in Besançon. He had hanged himself. He had been due to appear in court later that month for violent robberies, but he chose to end his life instead. When investigators made the connection between his car and Lena's disappearance, Ganin immediately became the prime suspect in what was now being treated as a kidnapping and murder. But he was beyond the reach of justice. The discovery of Lena's DNA in Ganin's car prompted a massive renewed search effort. On July 30, 2024, gendarmes combed through the valley of Bruche and the Vosges Mountains, focusing on locations where the GPS data from Ganin's vehicle had registered. The searches were exhaustive but yielded nothing. On August 3rd, the gendarmerie ended its search of the Anouilh forest in the Vosges after finding no additional evidence. 3 days later, on August 6th, 90 gendarmes resumed the search in the Saulx woods, 14 kilometers from Vesoul, using ground-penetrating radar to detect any anomalies in the soil. But again, they found nothing. In September 2024, the interim public prosecutor of Strasbourg revealed another horrifying detail. DNA from both Lena and Samuel Ganin had been found on ropes in the trunk of his car. The evidence proved that Lena had been tied up, confirming that she had been abducted and held against her will. The nightmare that her family had feared was now a confirmed reality. Then, on October 16, 2024, more than 13 months after Lena disappeared, her body was finally found. It was discovered in a wooded and isolated area in Sermoise-sur-Loire, a commune in the Nièvre department, nearly 500 kilometers from Saint-Blaise-la-Roche. Her remains were fully submerged in a body of water beneath an embankment, hidden in a remote location that few people would ever have reason to visit. The GPS data from Samuel Ganin's car showed that he had been at this exact location on September 24, 2023, the day after Lena's disappearance. DNA testing confirmed that the body was Lena's. The discovery brought an end to the agonizing uncertainty her family had endured, but it also marked the beginning of a new kind of grief. On October 25, 2024, a funeral was held at the St. Arnold Church in Plain. Friends, family, and members of the community gathered to say goodbye to a young woman whose life had been stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. An autopsy was performed to determine the cause of death, but the state of Lena's body made the task difficult. She had been submerged in water for over a year, and decomposition had taken its toll. However, forensic pathologists identified several marks and the presence of fabric found between the bottom of her skull and the top of her neck. These findings led them to conclude that the most likely cause of death was mechanical strangulation, specifically asphyxiation using the handles of a bag. Analysis confirmed that the fabric was from a tote bag. The pathologists were cautious in their conclusions due to the degraded state of the remains, but all evidence pointed to a violent and deliberate killing. The investigators also attempted to determine whether Lena had been subjected to other forms of violence, but the condition of her body made it impossible to carry out certain examinations. What was clear, however, was that Samuel Ganin had acted alone. The authorities concluded that all elements of the case pointed to a solitary action on his part. There was no evidence of accomplices, no indication that anyone else had been involved in the abduction, assault, or murder of Lena Delzarte. The case raised haunting questions that will likely never be answered. Why had Samuel Gonin targeted Lena? Had he been lying in wait for her specifically, or had she simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? What had happened during the hours or days she was in his custody? The answers died with Gonin, leaving Lena's family and the investigators who worked so hard to find her with an incomplete picture of the horror she endured. For Lena's mother, the loss was unfathomable. She had spent months hoping against hope that her daughter would be found alive, that there would be some explanation, some way to bring her home. Instead, she was left to bury her child and grapple with the reality that Lena's final hours had been filled with terror and pain. The small community of Champagney, where Lena had lived, mourned alongside her family, struggling to comprehend how such evil could touch their quiet corner of the world. The case of Lena Delzarte is a stark reminder of how quickly a normal day can become a nightmare, how a routine walk to a train station can end in tragedy. It is a story of a young woman with dreams and plans, whose life was cut short by a predator she likely never even knew existed. It is also a story of the relentless work of investigators who refused to give up, who followed every lead and examined every piece of evidence until they finally brought Lena home. Samuel Gonin's suicide ensured that he would never face trial for his crimes, never be forced to account for what he had done. But the evidence speaks clearly enough. He abducted Lena Delzarte on September 23, 2023, tied her up, drove her hundreds of kilometers from her home, and killed her, discarding her body in a remote stream where he hoped she would never be found. His past history of violence against women suggests that Lena was not his first victim, only his last. Lena's story has resonated throughout France, becoming a symbol of the vulnerability that all young women face and the importance of vigilance and justice. Her name is remembered not just as a victim, but as a person who mattered, who was loved, and whose absence has left a wound that will never fully heal. The investigation may be closed, the body found, the suspect identified, but for those who knew and loved Lena Delzarte, the pain will endure, a permanent scar on their hearts. Story 3. The autumn sun hung low over Sydney's eastern suburbs on Monday, September 15, 2003, casting long shadows across the campus of the University of New South Wales. In the modest student district of Kingsford, just a short walk from the university gates, 3 young Singaporean men shared the upper floor of a red brick duplex at 109 Barker Street. They were thousands of miles from home, pursuing engineering degrees that would shape their futures, living the familiar narrative of countless international students who come to Australia seeking education and opportunity. None of them could have imagined that before the day ended, 2 would be dead, and the third would begin a 9-year nightmare that would transform all their lives into a cautionary tale about justice, doubt, and the mysteries that sometimes refuse to be solved. 26-year-old Tay Chow Liang was the quietest of the 3 flatmates, a thin, unassuming young man known for his remarkable kindness and willingness to help strangers. Born in 1977, Chow Liang came from modest circumstances in Singapore, where his parents worked as food vendors to finance his education abroad. He had married a high school classmate named Winnie Leong in a simple registry office ceremony before leaving for Australia, carrying her photograph in his wallet and buying her Winnie the Pooh toys that spoke to a gentle romanticism. Though his English was limited, he navigated university life with quiet determination, spending his evenings at the computer or watching television, and learning to play the organ because he dreamed of performing Pachelbel's canon at a proper wedding ceremony with his wife once his studies concluded. His closest companion in the flat was 27-year-old Tony Tan Po Chuan, a rotund, jovial man whose smile seemed perpetual and whose enthusiasm for life infected everyone around him. Born on December 3, 1976, Tony had grown up in a small flat with his parents and sister, excelling at table tennis and embracing the outdoor life during his military service as a signaller. Like Chow Liang, he too had a wife back in Singapore, though the circumstances were complicated by kindness rather than love. A civil marriage to a woman named Yo Kar Loy, who had become emotionally dependent on him. Despite his own romantic complexities, Tony was sociable and strong, the kind of friend who never let anything interfere with his university work, but knew how to enjoy himself when the books were closed. The third member of their household was 24-year-old Ram Puneet Tiwari, known to his friends by the military nicknames Rex and Ranger. He is tall with a deep chest and powerful shoulders. Ram cut an imposing figure that belied a soft-spoken demeanor and a reputation among friends as considerate, loyal, and peaceful. He had come to Australia in 2000 on a Singapore Armed Forces scholarship to study mechanical engineering, embracing the freedom of Sydney life while maintaining close friendships and a relationship with a fellow engineering student named Elvira Medaljevic. His friends knew him as someone who would talk others out of bar fights rather than participate in them, who helped drunk friends get home safely, and who preferred walking away from confrontation rather than escalating it. The weekend before that fateful Monday had unfolded with ordinary routines and unremarkable moments that would later be scrutinized for hidden meanings. On Friday night, Ram attended a Chinese mooncake festival party, hosted by a friend, arriving at 10 in the evening exhausted from a late dinner the previous night. Saturday morning found him having breakfast at McDonald's with friends before making a decision that would become central to the tragedy ahead. He walked into Rebel Sport and purchased a baseball bat, telling himself it was a novelty item, the kind of fun accessory he had enjoyed playing with at a friend's house. He kept the receipt, made no attempt to conceal the purchase, and took it home to the Barker Street flat. That weekend, Ram worked 2 security guard shifts, the second one lasting all day Sunday at Cranbrook School in the eastern suburbs. When he returned home around 7 in the evening, exhausted from minimal sleep and long hours of work, he found Tony and Chow Liang in the living room watching movies on DVD. The 3 flatmates watched together, exchanging occasional comments about the film in the casual way of people comfortable in each other's presence. Around 9 o'clock, Tony retreated to his room to study, and Ram went to bed around the same time, his habit of nocturnal living momentarily overcome by fatigue. When sleep claimed him, Chow Liang was still in the living room, absorbed in the film. Monday morning arrived with the routines that structured the lives of diligent students. Chow Liang and Tony normally rose by 8, had breakfast, showered and shaved, then studied before their noon lecture. Though both were Singaporean and attended the same engineering classes, they had only become truly close after Tony moved into the Barker Street flat earlier in 2003, but by September they were inseparable at the university. Their pattern was to leave together at 11:45 for the short walk to campus. Chow Liang last used his computer at 10:16 that morning. Tony was working on his thesis about speech enhancement of digital audio files, sending 2 emails to his supervisor before switching off his computer at 12:02 in the afternoon. What happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny, conflicting theories, and enduring mystery. For reasons that remain unexplained, Chow Liang and Tony broke their established habit and did not leave the flat together. Tony departed late, and Chow Liang never left at all. At some point around midday, someone approached Chow Liang from behind as he sat at the computer desk in the living room. The attack was swift and brutal. Multiple blows with a blunt instrument, possibly a baseball bat or metal bar, shattered his skull and damaged his brain. His left index finger was crushed and lacerated, evidence of a desperate attempt to defend himself. He fell instantly to the floor behind the couch, blood spreading around him, unconscious but still breathing. Several classmates noticed Tony's unusual behavior when he arrived late and alone at the midday lecture. The 150-seat theater was half full, and instead of sitting in his usual place beside Chow Liang, Tony took a seat next to Wahan Custono, who immediately observed that something was wrong. Tony's hair was messy and uncombed, a stark contrast to his normally neat, gelled appearance. When another student asked why he was late, Tony only smiled vaguely and said nothing. He seemed restless, turning his head constantly as though looking for someone, paying little attention to the lecture. Most tellingly, he told classmates to cancel the ethics tutorial planned for later that day, explaining that Chow Liang had something to do. Somehow, Tony knew his flatmate would not be coming to the university. The lecture finished early at 1:50 in the afternoon. Outside the theater, Tony told one friend he was tired and going home to sleep. As he made his way down the outdoor stairs to Willis Street, other students noticed his agitation. One friend called out a greeting, and Tony grunted a response, but without his usual smile, seeming preoccupied and moving quickly. Then came the observation that would haunt investigators for years. A student named Jonathan Choi watched as Tony approached a white car, possibly a Toyota Echo, parked facing the wrong direction against one-way traffic in front of a no-stopping sign. Tony opened the back door and got in. There were 3 people in the car, all of Asian appearance, none of them recognized by the witnesses. Another student saw Tony taking off his bag as though preparing to enter the vehicle. The car drove past the witnesses and turned east onto Norton Street. 10 minutes later, Tony Tan Po Chuan would be dead. What transpired in those final moments can only be reconstructed from the terrible evidence left behind. Tony returned to the flat at 109 Barker Street, removed his shoes in the customary manner, and walked to the kitchen to prepare lunch. He placed chicken wings in a frying pan on the stove and began cooking. To reach the kitchen, he must have walked past Chow Liang's body, partially concealed behind the couch, though whether he saw it remains unknown. As he emerged from the kitchen, violence erupted with shocking ferocity. He was struck in the mouth and eyes with a baseball bat, breaking teeth and shattering his glasses. Blood began to spray across the walls and furniture. Tony ran for his life down the hallway toward the front door. Blood smeared along the walls as he desperately sought escape. The attack continued with relentless brutality, at least 12 blows with the baseball bat crushing his skull and leaving lacerations, possibly more that left bruising without breaking the skin. Plastic shrink wrap from the bat tore away and became embedded in his wounds. Tony reached for the door lock, his blood marking the keyhole, but his escape was thwarted. 5 stab wounds to his neck followed, delivered with a black-handled kitchen knife. One wound pierced so deeply it cut through his voice box. Another penetrated the base of his tongue. Defensive wounds on the backs of his hands showed he had tried to fight back. He collapsed by the front door, his body blocking it, sitting upright with his back against the wall, blood pooling around him and spattering the ceiling above. Behind the couch in the living room, Chow Liang lay where he had fallen hours earlier. His attacker returned to him, perhaps realizing he still breathed, and delivered the final violence. Multiple stab wounds to his neck and forehead ensured there would be no survival. The flat became a chamber of horror. Blood covered the floors, walls, and ceiling. Furniture had been shoved out of place during the struggles. The television continued playing at high volume. On the stove, the chicken wings burned at the bottom of the pan. And in one of the bedrooms, Ram Puneet Tiwari slept through it all, or so he would claim. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Ram says he woke to the sound of something falling and a commotion. He heard shouting and the sound of people running past his room. There was loud pounding on his door and a scream he believed might have been Tony calling for help, though he could not be certain through the door and the blaring television. His mind jumped to the assumption that someone was breaking in. Heavy footfalls continued toward the front door. The sound of metal hitting against something, like a door being forced open, cemented his fear. His reaction, which he would profoundly regret and struggle to explain for the rest of his life, was to lock and barricade his door. He did not go outside. The sound stopped. In the sudden calm, Ram decided to venture out cautiously. Opening his bedroom door, he walked into a nightmare. Blood was everywhere. The living room was in chaos, furniture displaced and covered in blood spatter. At the end of the hallway, he saw Tony sitting upright against the wall in a spreading pool of blood, his head covered in it, recognizable only by his familiar clothes and body shape. A knife and bat, both covered in blood, lay near his legs. Ram picked up the bat, the feel of it giving him courage to walk back up the hallway and close the back door. Then he discovered Chow Liang's body behind the sofa, bloody and battered. The flesh was not warm when Ram touched it. At 2:20 in the afternoon, Ram Tiwari called 000. The The emergency operator instructed him to leave the bat and get to the ambulance. He ran out of his room, down the back steps, along the side walkway, and onto Barker Street, expecting at any moment to be attacked. When he reached the street, there were no ambulances visible, and paranoia surged through him that he had been lured into the open. Then he spotted 2 ambulances parked up the road about 20 meters away. He sprinted toward them. The paramedics, seeing an agitated man running toward them wearing shorts and an inside-out jumper, locked their doors. Ram stood outside in bewilderment as they spoke to him through a narrow window opening. Another paramedic from the 2nd ambulance called him over. Police cars began arriving, marked and unmarked vehicles swarming the area. Ram identified himself to the uniformed and plainclothes officers. He appeared extremely distressed, breathing heavily, upset. He had blood on his hands, which he explained came from touching Tony to check if he was alive. Inside the unit, ambulance officers officially pronounced Chow Liang and Tony deceased at 2:39 in the afternoon. Ram agreed to accompany detectives to the station to give his statement. He remained there until 11 that night, undergoing an electronically recorded interview and voluntary forensic procedure. He told the police he had been woken by the first murder and was awake and out of bed by the second, a statement that would be misreported and misunderstood for years. It was not an alibi in any traditional sense. Anyone attempting to conceal involvement in a double murder would have manufactured something far more convincing. But Ram told them the truth as he knew it, and as forensic evidence trickled in, it did not convincingly attach him to the murders. Yet the police did not believe him. If Ram's innocence was to be accepted, unknown murderers had entered the flat, attacked Chow Liang, left, returned 2 hours later to kill Tony, and departed without ever checking the bedroom where Ram slept. It defied common sense. Ram's fingerprints were on the murder weapons, though he had admitted to picking them up. Making him their chief suspect, investigators sought a motive. They claimed Ram owed Chow Liang 5,045 Australian dollars in rent, a claim Ram disputed, arguing that a spreadsheet entry reading inflow, Ram till June, indicated he had already paid through June. They suggested he owed university fees, and that a financial dispute had erupted that morning, resulting in Chow Liang's death and Tony's murder to cover it up. The motive seemed flimsy to many observers. Ram's family could have easily settled a debt of $7,000. It hardly seemed substantial enough to drive someone to commit a brutal double homicide. 8.5 months after the murders, on May 27, 2004, Ram called Detective Mark Ferson and asked if he could return to Singapore, explaining that university was not going well and he had commitments at home. 10 minutes later, the detective called back and asked Ram to come in for a final interview. Ram was completely oblivious that his decision to leave had triggered a flurry of activity to arrest him. The next morning at 7:30, he arrived at Maroubra Police Station for the agreed appointment. Detectives had left earlier to try to arrest him en route, and when they returned to find him waiting in the lobby, they met his extended hand with stony faces and an announcement that he was being arrested for the murder of his friends. The trial that followed in 2006 became a battleground of competing narratives and ambiguous evidence. The prosecution painted a picture of premeditated murder motivated by debt and covered up to eliminate a witness. The defense highlighted the glaring absence of Chow Liang's blood or DNA on Ram, on his clothing, or on the baseball bat found at the scene. Expert witnesses testified that the ferocity of the attacks would have resulted in copious blood spatter on the assailant. The small amount of Tony's blood found on Ram could be explained by an expiration reflex, a cough that expelled blood as Ram checked for a pulse. 2 expert witnesses supported this theory, and Justice Michael Adams told the jury that the medical evidence suggested Tony could have and did cough. Where was the rest of the blood if Ram had committed both murders? He called emergency services at 2:20, meaning if Tony was attacked after 2:05 or even 2:10, Ram would have had mere minutes to remove extensive blood from himself, his clothing, and the bathroom, leaving no trace. Why would someone planning a murder place himself under such time pressure? And why leave the small amount of Tony's blood that was on him if he had successfully cleaned away all evidence of Chao Liang's murder. The baseball bat presented another puzzle. Plastic shrink wrap from the bat was found in Tony's wounds and on his clothes, but no such wrap was found on Chao Liang. DNA testing failed to show Chao Liang's blood or DNA on the bat. The evidence suggested Chao Liang had been attacked with different weapons, possibly brought from outside and disposed of, while Tony was killed with items from the flat itself. Tony had told classmates weeks before the murders that he owned a baseball bat for protection, but that bat was never found. Most compelling were the witnesses who saw Tony get into a car with unknown individuals of Asian appearance. Tony's unusual behavior at the lecture, his disheveled appearance, his restlessness and distraction, his knowledge that Chao Liang would not be coming to university, all pointed to someone who knew something terrible had happened or was happening. The blood on the exterior keyhole of the front door indicated that someone with Tony's blood on them had exited through that door before the final assault in the hallway. Tony's body completely blocked the door at the end of the attack. How could his blood have reached the exterior keyhole unless someone else had been involved? Despite these questions, the 12-member jury found Ram Tiwari guilty of double murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for Tony's murder and a concurrent 25 years for Chao Liang's murder in 2006. During his time in prison, fights with other inmates left him with partial loss of sensation in his right thumb and a scarred left shoulder. He wondered if racism had influenced his conviction. In 2008, the Court of Appeal set aside both Ram's life sentence and conviction, ordering a retrial based on a review of evidence that did not amount to murder and improper jury directions. The second trial in 2009 again returned a guilty verdict, this time by majority decision, and Ram received 48 years imprisonment. But in his second appeal in 2012, focused on his tone in the emergency call, the victim's unusual behavior witnessed by multiple people, and the forensic evidence, the Court of Appeal decided the evidence against Ram was not satisfactory. On July 26, 2012, 2 days after the hearing, they acquitted him of all charges. After 9 years, 8.5 of them in prison, Ram Puneet Tiwari walked free. He was detained for 6 weeks at Villawood Immigration Detention Center while prosecutors considered appealing and while he waited for a new Singaporean passport. On September 19, 2012, he stepped onto Singaporean soil. When Tony Tan's mother, Madam Chiu Li Hua, learned of the acquittal, she expressed the agony that continues to haunt the victims' families. "My heart is in pain," she said. "If it wasn't him, then who was it?" That question remains unanswered. The murders of Tay Chao Liang and Tony Tan Po Chuan are officially unsolved. No new suspects have been identified. The case remains open, a haunting mystery in the suburbs of Sydney, where 2 young men traveled thousands of miles to pursue their dreams and found only violence and death. The families of Chao Liang and Tony, whatever happens, are victims for life. The 3 people in the car who picked Tony up outside the university that afternoon have never been found. The truth of what happened in that flat on September 15, 2003, died with 2 promising young men whose futures were stolen in minutes of incomprehensible brutality. In the end, there are only questions without answers, grief without closure, and the terrible knowledge that sometimes justice cannot illuminate the darkness where monsters hide. Story 4. The small town of Garlasco in the Pavia province of northern Italy had always been the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where centuries-old churches cast long shadows over cobblestone streets, and where violent crime seemed like something that happened elsewhere, in the chaotic cities or on television crime dramas. On the morning of August 13, 2007, that comforting illusion shattered forever when 26-year-old Chiara Poggi was brutally murdered in her own home while her family vacationed nearby. What followed would become one of Italy's most controversial and complex criminal cases, a legal saga that would stretch across nearly 2 decades, involve multiple trials and acquittals and convictions, and ultimately leave more questions than answers about what truly happened on that summer morning in a villa on Via Pacoli. Chiara Poggi was a woman with her whole life ahead of her. She had recently graduated with a degree in economics, joining a generation of young Italians navigating the challenges of building careers in a changing economy. She was beautiful and ambitious, someone who had worked hard for her education and was beginning to envision the future she wanted to create. She lived with her parents and her younger brother Marco in a comfortable villa in Garlasco, a family home that should have been a sanctuary but would instead become the scene of unspeakable violence. On that particular morning, Chiara was alone in the house. Her parents and brother had gone on holiday, leaving her to enjoy a quiet few days by herself before they returned. She had no reason to be afraid, no warning that danger was approaching her front door. At approximately 1:50 in the afternoon, emergency services in Garlasco received a frantic phone call. On the other end of the line was Alberto Stasi, a 24-year-old economics student at the prestigious Bocconi University in Milan. Stasi was Chiara's boyfriend, and the anguish in his voice seemed genuine as he told the operator what he had found. When police and paramedics arrived at the Poggi villa, they discovered a scene of horrific brutality. Chiara's body lay on the stairs leading down to the cellar, sprawled on the 9th step in a growing pool of blood. She had been struck repeatedly on the head with a blunt object, bludgeoned with such force that her skull had been shattered. The weapon itself was nowhere to be found, already removed from the scene by whoever had killed her. Chiara was still wearing her pajamas, suggesting she had been attacked early in the morning, perhaps shortly after waking. As investigators began processing the crime scene, certain details immediately stood out. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. The doors and windows remained intact, undamaged, suggesting that Chiara had opened the door herself and let her killer inside. This meant she knew the person who had murdered her, trusted them enough to allow them into her home while she was still in her night clothes. The attacker had moved through the house with apparent familiarity, navigating the rooms and layout as if they had been there before. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, ruling out robbery as a motive. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong or a random act of violence by a stranger. This was personal, intimate, committed by someone who had access to Chiara's life and trust. Alberto Stasi became the immediate focus of the investigation, and for good reason. He was the one who had discovered the body, the boyfriend who claimed he had come to the villa to check on Chiara and found her dead. But investigators noticed troubling inconsistencies in his story and his appearance. His shoes were excessively clean, polished to an unusual shine, as if he had carefully cleaned them after walking through the blood that covered the floor where Chiara lay. If he had truly walked through the house searching for his girlfriend and found her in a pool of blood, his shoes should have shown at least some trace of that blood. Similarly, his clothing was pristine, without the stains one would expect from someone who had knelt beside a bleeding body in shock and grief. When pressed about the timeline of his movements that morning, Stasi provided answers that didn't quite align with the evidence. On September 24, 2007, just 6 weeks after Chiara's death, police arrested Alberto Stasi on suspicion of murder. But the case against Stasi was not as solid as investigators had hoped. For days after his arrest, investigating Judge Giulia Pravin ordered his release, citing insufficient evidence to hold him. The prosecution had suspicions and circumstantial details, but they lacked the concrete proof needed to charge a man with murder under Italian law. Nevertheless, Stasi remained the only person ever formally investigated for Chiara Poggi's death. As the investigation continued, the case became a media sensation throughout Italy. Television programs dedicated entire episodes to analyzing the evidence, newspapers ran daily updates, and the public became deeply invested in the question of Alberto Stasi's guilt or innocence. The most significant piece of evidence in Stasi's favor was his digital alibi. Forensic analysis of his laptop computer revealed that it had been turned on at his home at 9:36 on the morning of August 13, 2007. Digital photographs, including pornographic images of women's feet that spoke to Stasi's private interests, had been opened and viewed until 9:57 that morning. According to the computer's activity logs, Stasi had been working on his economics thesis during the crucial hours when investigators believed Chiara had been murdered. If the computer evidence was accurate, Stasi couldn't have been in Garlasco killing his girlfriend because he was at home, 19 kilometers away in the town of Vigevano, working on his laptop. His defense attorneys argued forcefully that this digital alibi proved his innocence beyond any reasonable doubt. When Alberto Stasi's case finally went to trial, he chose an abbreviated proceeding, a streamlined process under Italian law that can result in a reduced sentence if convicted, but moves more quickly than a full trial. On December 17, 2009, Judge Stefano Vitelli delivered his verdict at the court of Vigevano. Alberto Stasi was acquitted for not having committed the crime. The computer evidence had been persuasive, creating reasonable doubt about his presence at the murder scene. Stasi walked free, and for a moment it seemed the case might remain forever unsolved. But the prosecution refused to accept the acquittal. They appealed the verdict, and on December 7, 2011, an appeals court in Milan again acquitted Alberto Stasi, confirming that the evidence did not support a conviction. Twice now, the Italian judicial system had found him not guilty. According to Italian legal principles, this should have been the end of the matter. Yet the Supreme Court of Cassation, Italy's highest judicial authority, took the unprecedented step of overturning both acquittals and ordering a new appeal trial. The court argued that certain forensic evidence had not been properly considered and that witness testimony deserved closer examination. The second appeal trial brought new expert analysis to bear on the case. Forensic specialists conducted a computerized assessment of Alberto Stasi's gait, analyzing how he walked and moved. Witnesses had reported seeing someone arrive at the Poggi villa on a bicycle on the morning of the murder. The person had been riding a dark-colored women's bicycle, and the description was compatible with bicycles owned by the Stasi family. New scrutiny of the digital alibi raised questions about whether the computer activity truly proved Stasi had been at home. Some experts suggested that the computer could have been remotely accessed, or that the timestamps might not be as definitive as previously believed. DNA testing had been conducted on various items from the crime scene, but the results were inconclusive, neither definitively implicating Stasi nor clearing him. On December 17, 2014, the Court of Assizes of Appeal in Milan delivered a stunning reversal. After 2 acquittals, Alberto Stasi was found guilty of murdering Chiara Poggi. The court sentenced him to 24 years in prison, later reduced to 16 years due to the abbreviated trial procedure. The judges excluded the aggravating circumstances of premeditation and cruelty, suggesting they believed the murder had been an impulsive act rather than a calculated killing. According to the conviction, Stasi had arrived at the villa on a bicycle, been admitted by Chiara, who knew and trusted him, and then attacked her in a sudden fit of rage. The court never established a clear motive, unable to determine what had triggered such explosive violence between the couple. Some prosecutors theorized that Chiara might have discovered something disturbing on Stasi's computer, perhaps the pornographic images or other material that sparked a deadly confrontation. But this remains speculation, unproven and contested. Stasi's defense team immediately appealed to the Supreme Court of Cassation. Even the prosecutor at the Supreme Court level expressed doubts, surprisingly requesting that the conviction be annulled. But on December 12, 2015, the highest court in Italy confirmed the conviction. Alberto Stasi was definitively sentenced to 16 years of imprisonment for the murder of Chiara Poggi. He was ordered to pay €1 million in civil compensation to the Poggi family, later negotiated down to €700,000 after Stasi renounced his father's inheritance and declared himself penniless. He began serving his sentence at Bollate prison near Milan, working first as a switchboard operator and later training as an accountant. Throughout all the trials, appeals, and legal proceedings, Alberto Stasi never wavered in his proclamation of innocence. "I was acquitted in the first instance. I was acquitted on appeal," he told reporters years later. The Attorney General at the Court of Cassation clearly said, "You cannot convict Alberto Stasi." But despite this, I was condemned. He maintained that a terrible miscarriage of justice had occurred, that an innocent man had been imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. In January 2023, after serving most of his sentence, Stasi entered a work release program, allowed to leave the prison during the day to work as an accountant while returning to custody at night. He continued to speak of Chiara, though cautiously, aware that any public statements about the case could be used against him. Then, in March 2025, nearly 18 years after Chiara Poggi's murder, the case exploded back into public consciousness with developments that called everything into question. Forensic experts working for Alberto Stasi's defense team conducted new analysis of DNA evidence that had been collected at the crime scene, but never fully tested or compared. Specifically, they examined genetic material found under Chiara Poggi's fingernails. This DNA was crucial because it suggested Chiara had fought her attacker, clawing at them as she tried to defend herself against the brutal assault. The DNA under her nails should have belonged to her killer. According to forensic geneticist Ugo Ricci, who conducted the analysis, the genetic profiles found under Chiara's fingernails were compatible with a man named Andrea Sempio, not with Alberto Stasi. In fact, the testing specifically excluded Stasi as the donor of the DNA traces. Mine is a reassessment of data already present in the trial files, Ricci explained, confirmed by a world-famous expert like Lutz Rohr, who carried out an assessment on the same data sent anonymously. The DNA trace, experts confirmed, was extremely legible. Andrea Sempio was not a random stranger to the Poggi family. He had been a longtime friend of Marco Poggi, Chiara's younger brother. He was known to travel by bicycle around Garlasco and wore a shoe size similar to Alberto Stasi's. During the original investigation, Sempio had been questioned but never seriously considered as a suspect. His alibi for the morning of the murder had been accepted, and investigators had focused exclusively on Stasi. But now, with the DNA evidence pointing in a completely different direction, the entire case had to be reconsidered. On March 11, 2025, the Pavia Public Prosecutor's Office placed Andrea Sempio under investigation for complicity in the murder of Chiara Poggi. Additional evidence emerged that investigators had initially dismissed or overlooked. Fingerprint experts Gianpaolo Iuliano and Nicola Caprioli produced a report regarding a palm print labeled Footprint 33 that had been found on the basement wall near where Chiara's body lay. In the initial investigation by the RIS of Parma, this print had been deemed not useful for comparison purposes. Now, new analysis suggested the print matched Andrea Sempio's palm in 15 ridge characteristics, a significant number of matching points. Unfortunately, the actual print had not been properly preserved and existed only in photographs, making definitive confirmation difficult. The Poggi family, who had fought for years to see Alberto Stasi convicted and had accepted his guilt as justice for their daughter and sister, found themselves thrust back into uncertainty and controversy. Their attorney Francesco Campagna defended the original investigation and prosecution vigorously. Sempio was subjected to wiretaps. The murder investigations were conducted years and years earlier. This case was assessed by 2 preliminary investigations judges and by the Brescia Court of Appeal, Campagna explained. No evidence or proof has ever been found against Sempio. The family's geneticist, Marzio Capra, argued that the DNA evidence might not be as reliable as Stasi's defenders claimed. The legal and scientific battle over the genetic material found under Chiara's fingernails intensified throughout 2025. In September 2025, preliminary investigations Judge Daniela Garlascelli ordered extensive new forensic testing. Court-appointed experts including geneticist Denise Albany and fingerprint specialist Domenico Marchigiani were granted a 70-day extension to complete comprehensive analyses of all available DNA samples and fingerprint evidence. The DNA found under Chiara's nails would be compared with samples from Andrea Sempio and others to definitively determine whose genetic material had been left there during the violent struggle. The case remained open, the investigation ongoing, as autumn descended on Garlasco and another year passed since Chiara Poggi's death. Meanwhile, Alberto Stasi continued his semi-liberty work program, leaving prison each day to work as an accountant before returning to custody each night. In June 2025, the Court of Cassation confirmed that he would remain in this status while the new investigation proceeded. He had already served most of his 16-year sentence for a murder that new evidence suggested he might not have committed. If the DNA evidence ultimately exonerated him and implicated Andrea Sempio instead, it would represent one of the most egregious wrongful convictions in modern Italian legal history. A man twice acquitted would have been convicted anyway, imprisoned for years, his life destroyed by a justice system that ignored evidence pointing to another suspect. On the other hand, if Sempio were eventually cleared and the DNA evidence explained away, the question would remain: who killed Chiara Poggi on that August morning in 2007? The villa on Via Pacoli stands silent, its rooms forever marked by the violence that occurred there nearly 2 decades ago. Chiara Poggi, who should have been entering the prime of her life, building a career, perhaps marrying and having children of her own, was instead struck down at 26 by someone she trusted enough to open her door. Her family has endured nearly 18 years of grief compounded by legal battles, media scrutiny, and now the devastating possibility that the wrong man was convicted for her murder. The case remains a labyrinth of conflicting evidence, contested forensics, and irreconcilable narratives. Computer alibis that seem unshakable, DNA under fingernails that points away from the convicted killer, palm prints on basement walls, bicycles that may or may not have been ridden to the crime scene, shoes that were too clean, and a murder weapon that was never found. All of these pieces exist, but refuse to form a coherent picture that satisfies everyone. Alberto Stasi maintains he is innocent and has been monstrously wronged. The Poggi family believes justice was served in 2015, and that the new investigation is reopening old wounds for no purpose. Andrea Sempio, now under investigation, denies any involvement and claims the evidence against him is meaningless. As the new forensic tests proceed and December 2025 approaches with its deadline for results, the small town of Garlasco remains divided. Some believe Alberto Stasi killed his girlfriend in a moment of uncontrollable rage and has manipulated the legal system with clever defense strategies for 18 years. Others are convinced an innocent man was convicted twice after being acquitted twice, a victim of a prosecution desperate to close an unsolved case. And still others wonder if the truth is even more complicated, if there were multiple people involved, if secrets remain buried that might explain everything or nothing. What is certain is that on August 13, 2007, Chiara Poggi opened her door in her pajamas to someone she knew. That person bludgeoned her to death with savage force, struck her repeatedly until her skull shattered, and then left her body on the stairs to the cellar while her blood pooled around her. That person has lived with that secret for 18 years. Whether that person is Alberto Stasi, currently serving his sentence in semi-liberty, or Andrea Sempio, currently under investigation, or someone else entirely whom investigators have never even considered, remains the agonizing question at the heart of one of Italy's most controversial criminal cases. The murder of Chiara Poggi has no satisfying resolution, only ongoing investigations, competing theories, and a young woman's life that ended far too soon in a pool of blood on a summer morning in Garlasco. Story 5. The morning of March 18, 1988, began with the familiar rhythms of small-town life in Colbert County, Alabama, where rolling hills gave way to farmland and neighbors greeted each other by name at the local store. For 45-year-old Elizabeth Dorling Sennett, known to everyone as Liz, Friday mornings typically meant preparing for the weekend ahead, perhaps planning Sunday dinner or thinking about the sermon her husband Charles would deliver at the West Side Church of Christ in Sheffield, where he served as pastor. The Sennetts lived on Coon Dog Cemetery Road, a rural stretch where homes were separated by enough distance to provide privacy, but close enough that people looked out for one another. Liz and Charles had built what appeared to be a solid life together, raising their 2 sons, Mike and Chuck, serving their church community, embodying the values of faith and family that defined their corner of Alabama. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, darkness had been growing. Charles Sennett, the man who stood before his congregation each Sunday to preach about righteousness and salvation, was living a lie so profound that it would destroy everything he claimed to hold sacred. He was deeply in debt, having made poor financial decisions that had left him scrambling for money. He had taken out a large life insurance policy on his wife, a policy that would pay out handsomely in the event of her death. And he was engaged in an extramarital affair, betraying the marriage vows he had taken before God and the community he served. When financial pressures became too much and the weight of his double life grew unbearable, Charles Sennett made a decision that would horrify everyone who knew him. Rather than confess his sins, face his debts, or seek help for the problems that plagued him, he decided to have his wife murdered so he could collect the insurance money and start fresh with his mistress. It was a plan born of selfishness and cowardice, a betrayal so complete that it would shock even hardened investigators who had seen the worst of human nature. Charles approached Billy Gray Williams, one of his tenants, with a proposition that must have seemed surreal in its evil simplicity. He wanted Williams to kill his wife, or to arrange for someone else to do it. In exchange, there would be money, $1,000 for each person involved in the murder. For Williams, who was struggling financially himself, the offer was tempting enough that he agreed to participate in the horrific scheme. Williams in turn recruited two young men he knew, 22-year-old Kenneth Eugene Smith and John Forrest Parker, both of whom had criminal histories and were desperate enough for money that they were willing to commit murder for hire. The planning took place over several weeks. Charles Sennett met with the men, drew them a diagram of his house, explained the layout so they would know where to find Liz when the time came. He told them that the murder should be staged to look like a burglary gone wrong, an attempted robbery that had escalated into violence. He even gave them money to purchase a firearm to carry out the killing, though Smith and Parker would make a decision that would add unspeakable cruelty to the crime they had agreed to commit. Instead of using the money Charles had provided to buy a gun, Kenneth Smith and John Parker spent it on drugs. When March 18th arrived and the time came to carry out the murder they had been paid for, they armed themselves instead with a 6-inch survival knife and planned to use whatever they could find in the Sennett home to beat Liz into submission. It was a decision that would transform what might have been a quick death into a prolonged and brutal attack that was one of the most vicious crimes. On that Friday morning, with Charles away from home on his regular schedule, Kenneth Smith and John Parker arrived at the house on Coondog Cemetery Road. They knocked on the door, and when Liz answered, they told her that Charles had given them permission to survey the grounds for hunting purposes. It was a plausible story. Charles was known to allow people to hunt on the property, and Liz had no reason to be suspicious of two young men who claimed to have her husband's blessing to be there. She called Charles to verify their story, and he, playing his part in the murder plot perfectly, told her to let them in and allow them to look around. Liz returned to her activities inside the house while Smith and Parker pretended to walk the grounds. After a few minutes, they knocked on the door again and asked if they could use the bathroom and get some water. Liz, being neighborly and trusting, agreed and let them into her home. It was a decision that would cost her life, though she had no way of knowing that the men at her door were not hunters but hired killers. While John Parker went to the bathroom, Kenneth Smith talked with Liz, maintaining the pretense of normalcy. Then Parker emerged and approached Liz from behind, striking her in what would later describe as a blindside attack that caught her completely off guard. What followed was a sustained and vicious assault that lasted several minutes. Smith and Parker beat Liz with a fireplace set, a walking cane, and a piece of galvanized pipe, striking her over and over as she fought desperately for her life. But Liz fought it, and she fought hard, her body showing the evidence of a woman who refused to surrender easily to her attackers. But Liz was 45 years old, fighting against two younger men who had come prepared to kill. When the beating had left her barely conscious and unable to resist further, Smith and Parker pulled out the 6-inch survival knife. They stabbed her 8 times in the chest and once on each side of the neck, the blade puncturing vital organs and severing blood vessels as Liz's life drained away on the floor of her own home. The coroner would later testify that the multiple stab wounds to her chest and neck were the cause of death, though the beating alone had been severe enough to cause life-threatening injuries. After murdering Liz, Smith and Parker ransacked the house to make the crime look like a burglary. They took items from the residence, including a video recorder that would later be found in Kenneth Smith's home and used as evidence against him. Then they fled, leaving Liz's battered and stabbed body partially wrapped in an Afghan rug on the living room floor. When Charles Sennett returned home around 11:30 that morning and discovered what appeared to be the scene of a violent home invasion, he called the Colbert County Sheriff's Department at exactly 11:44. A secretary answered the phone and heard Charles screaming, his words unintelligible in his apparent distress. The call was transferred to Sheriff's Deputy Ronnie May, who listened as Charles explained that he had come home to find his wife dead, badly beaten and stabbed. May and other first responders rushed to the scene on Coon Dog Cemetery Road. What they found horrified them. Liz lay on the floor surrounded by blood, her face so badly beaten that one emergency medical technician, who was a close friend of the Sennett family, would later say he would not have recognized her if he had not already known her identity. The violence inflicted upon her was extraordinary in its brutality, speaking of rage or perhaps the desperate violence of drug-fueled criminals trying to subdue a victim who fought back harder than they had anticipated. When Sheriff May checked for a pulse, he could not find one. But when emergency medical technicians arrived and made their own assessment, they detected a faint heartbeat. Liz was still alive, barely clinging to life despite the catastrophic injuries she had sustained. May would later recall that when he told Charles that Liz still had a pulse, Charles almost fell. A reaction that seemed strange given that a husband learning his wife was alive should have been relieved rather than shocked. Sheriff May rode with Liz in the ambulance to the hospital, hoping that she might regain consciousness long enough to identify her attackers. But Liz's eyes never opened. She died in surgery approximately 2 hours after being found, her injuries too severe for doctors to save her. The investigation into her murder had officially begun, and it would lead to revelations that would stun the tight-knit community of Colbert County. Initially, investigators treated the case as they would any home invasion and robbery gone wrong. But things at the crime scene did not quite add up. Liz's sons, Mike and Chuck Sennett, expressed doubts from the beginning that anyone would rob their parents. The evidence left at the scene also did not make sense for a typical burglary. Items had been taken, but not the most valuable possessions in the house. The violence seemed excessive for a robbery, more personal and sustained than what one would expect from a burglar surprised by a homeowner. Within days of the murder, Alabama Governor Guy Hunt offered a $10,000 reward for information about Liz's killing, a sum equivalent to about $26,000 in today's money. The reward prompted someone with knowledge of the crime to come forward. On March 29, 1988, an anonymous female caller contacted the Colbert County Sheriff's Department asking about the reward. Sheriff May directed her to call through Crime Stoppers to receive the money, and when she did, she provided information that would crack the case wide open. She named Kenneth Smith, John Parker, and Billy Williams as the men responsible for Liz's death. On March 25, 1988, 1 week after Liz's murder, investigators brought Charles Sennett in for questioning. They had begun to suspect that the grieving pastor knew more about his wife's death than he had revealed. During the interview, Charles denied any involvement in the murder. But as he was leaving, someone asked him if he knew Kenneth Smith. Charles's face turned red, a tell so obvious that investigators knew immediately they were on the right track. Charles left the sheriff's department and drove to his church, where he called his sons and their families to meet him. When Mike and Chuck Sennett arrived, they found their father in a state of emotional collapse. Charles confessed to them that he had been having an affair. He admitted that he had arranged for their mother to be killed. The sons were shocked, unable to comprehend that their father, a minister who preached about morality and righteousness every Sunday, had hired men to murder their mother. After this devastating confession to his sons, Charles Sennett walked out to the church parking lot, got into his truck, and retrieved a gun. He placed the barrel against his head and pulled the trigger, ending his life in an act of suicide that robbed investigators of the opportunity to bring him to justice for orchestrating Liz's murder. Sheriff Ronnie May was one of the first people to arrive at the scene of Charles's death, just as he had been one of the first to arrive when Liz was found. May rode with Charles in the ambulance, hoping that the dying man might say something in his final moments that would explain what had driven him to such evil. But Charles never regained consciousness. With information from the anonymous tipster and evidence collected from the crime scene and subsequent searches, investigators arrested Kenneth Smith, John Parker, and Billy Gray Williams. Smith confessed to police, providing details about the murder plot and his role in Liz's death. He admitted that Charles Sennett had paid them each $1,000 to kill his wife, that Charles had drawn them a diagram of the house, that the murder was supposed to look like a burglary that had gone bad. During the search of Smith's home, investigators found the video recorder that had been taken from the Sennett residence, physical evidence that tied him directly to the crime scene. The trials that followed would stretch across years and generate significant legal proceedings. Kenneth Smith was tried and convicted of capital murder for pecuniary gain, murder committed for financial reward, on March 18, 1988, for the killing of Elizabeth Dorling Sennett. His trial was moved from Colbert County to Jefferson County on a change of venue to reduce pretrial publicity. The jury that heard the evidence found Smith guilty and recommended by a vote of 10-2 that he be sentenced to death. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation and sentenced Smith to death. John Forrest Parker, Smith's accomplice, was also convicted and sentenced to death. He was executed in 2010, 22 years after Liz Sennett's murder. Billy Gray Williams, the middleman who had recruited Smith and Parker on Charles Sennett's behalf, received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated at Donaldson Correctional Facility in Jefferson County, Alabama. For Mike and Chuck Sennett, the years following their mother's murder and their father's suicide were marked by a grief compounded by betrayal. They had lost both parents in the span of 1 week, their mother to a brutal murder and their father to suicide after confessing his role in that murder. The man they had looked up to, the minister who had taught them about right and wrong, had orchestrated the killing of the woman who had given them life. It was a betrayal so profound that no amount of time could fully heal the wounds it left. In interviews given decades later, Mike Sennett expressed frustration at how long it had taken for justice to be fully carried out. "The man's been in prison right at twice as long as we knew our mom," he said, referring to Kenneth Smith's time on death row. For the Sennett sons, the execution of their mother's killers could never bring her back, could never restore the family that had been destroyed on March 18, 1988, but it represented a measure of accountability for the men who had taken her life for nothing more than $1,000 each. Elizabeth Dorling Sennett was 45 years old when she was beaten and stabbed to death in her own home by 2 men she had allowed inside because she believed they had her husband's permission to be there. She fought for her life with everything she had, leaving evidence of her desperate struggle in the defensive wounds and the crime scene that spoke of prolonged violence. She was a mother who loved her sons, a woman who had no idea that the man she had married and trusted had decided her life was worth less than an insurance payout and a chance to escape his debts and start over with another woman. The case of Elizabeth Sennett stands as a testament to the darkest aspects of human nature: the willingness to commit murder for money, the betrayal of sacred vows, the exploitation of trust, and the casual brutality of men who could stab a woman to death and then steal her possessions to make it look like a robbery. It is a reminder that evil can hide behind a collar and a pulpit, that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who harm us, and that violence leaves scars that stretch across generations, marking families forever with grief and unanswered questions about how someone they loved could have been capable of such monstrous acts. Story 6. The Friday after Thanksgiving 2020 began with the gentle rhythms that had become familiar to 26-year-old Alexis Sharkey in the year since she had moved to Houston, Texas, with her husband Tom. For a young woman whose Instagram feed showcased a life of carefully curated glamour, sun-drenched photos from trips to Marfa, perfectly posed shots in designer outfits, inspirational quotes about entrepreneurship and self-empowerment, the reality behind the screen was considerably more complex. Alexis, whose maiden name was Robinault, had built a following of tens of thousands on social media by presenting an aspirational lifestyle centered around her work as a mentor for Monat, a multi-level marketing company that sold haircare products. Her posts featured glossy images of success and independence, a young woman thriving in the competitive world of social media influence. But those closest to Alexis knew that the picture-perfect life she displayed online masked a troubled marriage to Tom Sharkey, a man 23 years her senior, who had grown increasingly controlling as cracks began to appear in their relationship. Alexis had spent Thanksgiving Day with friends rather than with Tom, a choice that spoke volumes about the state of their marriage. During a trip to Marfa, Texas, just a month earlier in October, Alexis had broken down in front of friends and confided that she was scared, that things at home had become unbearable. She spoke of problems in her marriage that went beyond the ordinary difficulties couples face, hinting at dynamics of control and fear that her friends found deeply concerning. She was worried. If something happened to her, it would be her husband, one friend would later tell reporters. These were not casual concerns or passing anxieties. They were the warnings of a woman who sensed genuine danger in her own home. On November 27, 2020, the day after Thanksgiving, Alexis was last seen alive around 6 o'clock in the evening. What happened in the hours that followed remains known only to Alexis and the person who killed her. The relationship between Alexis and Tom had deteriorated to the point where she was planning to leave him. Conversations about divorce had begun, and Tom desperately wanted to reconcile, while Alexis had made clear she did not. For a controlling husband facing the prospect of losing the beautiful young wife he had brought to Houston just 10 months earlier, Alexis's determination to end the marriage may have been more than he could tolerate. The morning of November 28, 2020, brought a discovery that would shock Houston and the social media community that had followed Alexis's carefully crafted online presence. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, a City of Houston Public Works employee was making his rounds in the Energy Corridor neighborhood, an area of northwest Houston near Interstate 10 and Eldridge Parkway. On the 1000 block of Red Haw Lane, a quiet residential street lined with bushes and trees, the worker noticed something that made him stop. In the bushes along the roadway lay the body of a young woman. She showed no visible signs of trauma, no apparent wounds that would immediately indicate how she had died. But she was deceased, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had been placed there rather than having walked to that location herself. Police were called to the scene and began treating the death as suspicious from the outset. The woman's nude condition, the location of her body in bushes along a residential street, and the absence of any identification all pointed to foul play rather than natural causes or accident. Tom Sharkey arrived at the Harris County Medical Examiner's office the next morning to identify the body. It was his 26-year-old wife Alexis, the Instagram influencer who had projected an image of success and happiness to thousands of followers while privately fearing for her safety. The news of Alexis's death spread rapidly through social media, where her followers struggled to reconcile the vibrant, smiling woman from her Instagram posts with the grim reality of her naked body found on a Houston street. Her mother, Stacy Robinault, told reporters that she had last spoken to her daughter on Thanksgiving, just days before Alexis's body was discovered. Stacy described her daughter as having a gift for making anyone feel good, someone who was talented at her work with Monat, and who seemed to be building a successful independent business. The sudden, violent nature of her death seemed incomprehensible to those who knew only the carefully constructed persona Alexis had presented online. Houston Police Department homicide detectives launched an investigation, but for weeks they provided little public information about suspects or arrests. Tom Sharkey, meanwhile, posted on social media about his wife's death, addressing what he characterized as crap talk from online commenters who were already beginning to speculate about his potential involvement. Approximately 2 weeks after Alexis's murder, Tom left Texas entirely, a decision that investigators would later characterize as evasive behavior designed to avoid scrutiny. In January 2021, the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences released its official determination of how Alexis Sharkey had died. The medical examiner's report stated that she had been strangled and that her death was a homicide. This confirmation transformed what had been a suspicious death investigation into a murder case, though police still did not publicly name any suspects. When Tom failed to make funeral arrangements for his wife, the medical examiner changed Alexis's next of kin designation to her mother Stacy. On December 19, 2020, a private funeral service was held for Alexis. The service was deliberately kept secret from Tom, a decision that spoke to the family's growing conviction that he had been responsible for their daughter's death. For months, the investigation continued quietly behind the scenes. Detectives interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, and attempted repeatedly to contact Tom Sharkey, who had relocated and was proving difficult to reach. In early August 2021, Tom finally agreed to meet with detectives to provide a DNA sample, a routine procedure in homicide investigations that could help exclude him as a suspect if he was innocent or implicate him if the evidence pointed toward his guilt. But when the appointed day arrived, Tom failed to appear. He had promised to cooperate and then simply didn't show up, another evasion in a pattern of behavior that investigators found increasingly suspicious. As detectives reviewed all the evidence they had collected, witness statements from Alexis's friends about her fears, documentation of the couple's deteriorating relationship, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and Tom's evasive behavior, they reached a conclusion. On September 29, 2021, nearly 10 months after Alexis's murder, Houston police obtained an arrest warrant for Thomas Sharkey, charging him with his wife's murder. The warrant was deliberately kept quiet, with investigators choosing not to publicize it immediately because of the high-profile nature of the case. They wanted to ensure that when Tom was taken into custody, he would have no advance warning that might allow him to flee. A fugitive task force consisting of U.S. Marshals began the work of locating Tom Sharkey. They tracked him to Fort Myers, Florida, where he had been staying with his daughter and her partner. On the evening of October 5, 2021, the task force pinpointed Tom's exact location at a residence in Fort Myers. Late that night, shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning on October 6th, U.S. Marshals approached the home where Tom was staying. What happened next ensured that Tom Sharkey would never face trial for his wife's murder, would never have to answer questions about what he had done to Alexis on that November night, would never be forced to account for the life he had taken. When Tom learned that law enforcement officials were at the residence looking for him, he ran upstairs. There, alone in a room, Tom Sharkey retrieved a firearm, placed it against his head, and pulled the trigger. He died instantly from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, escaping the arrest warrant that would have brought him back to Houston in handcuffs to face a murder charge. On October 6, 2021, Houston Police Department Sergeant Michael Burrow held a press conference to inform the public about the developments in Alexis Sharkey's murder case. He confirmed that Tom Sharkey had been the target of an arrest warrant for Alexis's murder, and that Tom had taken his own life as authorities attempted to take him into custody. Burrow explained that the investigation had determined Tom was the only person who had the means, motive, and opportunity to have committed the murder. The sergeant provided additional details that painted a picture of a marriage in crisis. There had been a history of domestic violence between Tom and Alexis, though Alexis had never filed an official complaint with police. Friends and family members confirmed that Alexis had made statements to them about Tom physically abusing her. The evidence showed clearly that the couple had separated, and that while Tom desperately wanted to reconcile the relationship, Alexis had made it equally clear she did not want to continue the marriage. "There's every indication that that was the direction it was going," Burrow said, referring to divorce proceedings that Alexis appeared to have been planning. Burrow also noted that Tom Sharkey had not been truthful or forthcoming in his communications with investigators. He had left Texas shortly after Alexis's death, had been evasive when police attempted to contact him, and had ultimately fled to Florida rather than cooperating with the investigation. All of this behavior, combined with the evidence detectives had gathered about the couple's troubled relationship and Tom's history of violence toward Alexis, had led investigators to seek the arrest warrant. With Tom's death, the case was effectively closed, though in a manner that left many questions unanswered. There would be no trial where evidence could be presented, no opportunity for prosecutors to lay out their case in detail, and no chance for Alexis's family to hear Tom admit what he had done. He had taken his guilt with him to the grave, leaving behind only the circumstantial evidence and witness statements that had convinced investigators he was responsible for strangling his wife and leaving her naked body in bushes along a Houston street. For Stacy Robinault and the rest of Alexis's family and friends, Tom's suicide brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was a sense of vindication that police had identified Tom as the killer, confirming what many of them had suspected from the beginning. But there was also frustration that he would never face justice in a courtroom, never be held publicly accountable for what he had done, never be forced to explain why he had killed a young woman whose only crime was wanting to leave a marriage that had become unbearable. Alexis Sharkey's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of domestic violence, about how the carefully curated perfection of social media can mask profound suffering, and about how women who try to leave controlling partners can face fatal consequences. Her Instagram feed, frozen in time at the moment of her death, remains a digital memorial to a life cut short at 26. The aspirational posts about building a business, the glamorous photos from trips around Texas, the inspirational quotes about empowerment, all of it took on new, tragic meaning in light of how her life ended. The investigation revealed that Alexis had worked hard to build her Monat business, recruiting other salespeople through Instagram and creating content that portrayed her as successful and independent. She had thoroughly researched the company before deciding to become a mentor, her mother said, and had been good at what she did. But the multi-level marketing model that promised financial independence had not protected her from the violence that was brewing in her own home. No amount of social media followers, no carefully posed photographs, no inspirational captions about self-empowerment could save her from a husband who could not accept that she wanted to leave. On November 27, 2020, Alexis Sharkey was last seen alive around 6 o'clock in the evening. Sometime in the hours that followed, Tom Sharkey strangled the life out of his 26-year-old wife. He stripped her naked and placed her body in bushes on Red Hall Lane, leaving her to be discovered by a city worker the next morning. Then he spent nearly a year evading investigators, lying to police, and refusing to cooperate with the investigation into the murder he had committed. When authorities finally closed in on him with an arrest warrant, Tom chose to shoot himself rather than face the consequences of his actions. Alexis Sharkey's murder remains officially solved in the records of the Houston Police Department, with Tom Sharkey identified as her killer. But for her mother, her friends, and the thousands of social media followers who had watched her cultivate an image of success and happiness, the case ended without the closure that a trial and conviction might have provided. They are left with photographs of a beautiful young woman who smiled for cameras while privately fearing the man she had married, who built a following by projecting strength while quietly planning her escape from domestic violence, and who died at 26 because her husband decided that if he could not have her, no one else would either. Story 7. The afternoon of January 12, 2022, began like so many others for 23-year-old Aisling Murphy, a beloved primary school teacher at Scoil Nam Comsel in Duo, County Offaly, Ireland. She finished her day of teaching first-class pupils at 2:30 in the afternoon, her classroom filled with the laughter and energy of 6- and 7-year-olds who adored their young teacher. Security cameras captured her walking to her car at 2:37, carrying her belongings after another fulfilling day spent shaping young minds and nurturing the love of learning in her students. Aisling had only recently secured this full-time position, having graduated just months earlier in October 2021 from Mary Immaculate College in Limerick with a Bachelor of Education degree in primary teaching. Everything in her life was moving forward with promise and purpose. She climbed into her red Seat Cordoba and drove along the N52 toward Tullamore, the town where she had grown up, where her family still lived, where her roots ran deep in the community. Tullamore, the county seat of Offaly in Ireland's Midlands, was a place where Aisling felt safe, where she knew the streets and paths, where neighbors looked out for one another. She parked at the Dangan Road car park near the Grand Canal, a popular recreation area where locals walked, jogged, and cycled along the scenic towpath that followed the historic waterway. The Grand Canal, constructed in the late 18th century to transport goods between Dublin and the River Shannon, had long since ceased commercial operations and now served as a peaceful corridor for exercise and contemplation, its calm waters reflecting the sky and trees that lined its banks. Aisling was not just a teacher, but also an accomplished traditional Irish musician, a talented fiddle player who performed with passion and skill at sessions and concerts throughout Ireland. Music ran through her veins as deeply as teaching did, and she brought joy to audiences with her performances, keeping alive the cultural traditions that defined Irish identity. She was also a camogie player, participating in Ireland's traditional women's sport with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything she did. At 23, she was vibrant, ambitious, deeply connected to her community, surrounded by family and friends who loved her, and in a relationship with her boyfriend Ryan Casey, with whom she was building a future. As Aisling set out for her exercise walk along the canal towpath that Wednesday afternoon, the winter sun was already beginning its early descent toward the horizon, the January light thin and pale. She wore her exercise clothing, earphones in her ears, perhaps listening to music as she walked along the familiar path. The towpath was not deserted. Other people were out enjoying the afternoon, walking dogs, jogging, cycling, all of them seeking fresh air and movement on a day that held no hint of the horror that was about to unfold. What Aisling didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that someone was watching her. 31-year-old Josef Puska, a Slovak Romani national who had been living in Ireland since 2013, was cycling along the canal towpath that afternoon. He lived with his wife and 5 children in the village of Mucklack, approximately 5 kilometers southwest of Tullamore. He had moved to Ireland more than a decade earlier, following his parents who had settled in Crumlin, Dublin, and his brothers who had made their homes in Tullamore. By all accounts, he had no criminal record in Ireland or Slovakia, had never come to the attention of police before this day, and gave no outward indication of being a dangerous person. But on this particular afternoon, something dark had taken hold of Josef Puska. Security camera footage captured him leaving Mucklack at 12:25 in the afternoon, riding his Falcon Storm mountain bike with distinctive bright green forks, wearing a black jacket and black tracksuit bottoms with a white stripe and a Tommy Hilfiger logo. As he cycled into Tullamore, he began following women. At approximately 1:38 in the afternoon, cameras showed him cycling slowly behind a woman as she walked along Church Road toward the Tesco supermarket in the Tullamore Retail Park. When she entered the supermarket, he stopped following her, but his intent was clear. He was hunting. At around 2 o'clock, he began following another woman, and Marie Kelly, as she walked her dog along Church Road. For reasons she would never fully understand, but would forever be grateful for, he did not attack her. Instead, he continued cycling, making his way toward the Grand Canal towpath where Aisling Murphy was walking. What happened next occurred in broad daylight, on a popular walking path, where other people were present and could hear but not prevent the violence that erupted. Josef Puska attacked Aisling Murphy with sudden, overwhelming force. He overpowered the young woman, dragging her off the towpath and into an adjacent ditch where he stabbed her repeatedly in the neck. The attack was frenzied and brutal, with Aisling suffering 11 stab wounds to her neck as she fought desperately for her life. 2 women jogging along the canal, Jenna Stack and Aoife Marin, came upon the attack in progress and immediately recognized that something terrible was happening. Jenna Stack, herself a primary school teacher, shouted at Puska that she had a phone and was calling the police. It was a bluff. She didn't actually have her phone with her, but she hoped the threat might make him stop, might save Ashling's life. Instead, Puska lunged toward Jenna and Aoife, forcing them to run away to raise the alarm. They ran as fast as they could, finding help, calling emergency services, trying to get assistance to Aisling before it was too late. By the time emergency responders arrived, Aisling Murphy was dead. She had been murdered on a public towpath in the middle of the afternoon, killed by a stranger she had never met, a random victim of incomprehensible violence. Her body was discovered at approximately 4 o'clock that afternoon, and the news sent shockwaves through Tullamore, through County Offaly, through all of Ireland. The Garda Síochána, Ireland's national police service, immediately launched a major investigation. More than 50 officers were assigned to the case, which was jointly headed by Detective Superintendent Pat O'Callaghan and Detective Inspector Brian Farrell. An incident room was established at Tullamore Garda Station, and investigators began the painstaking work of gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing security camera footage from throughout the town. Meanwhile, Josef Puska had fled the scene, cycling away from the canal and returning to his home in Mucklach. According to his later admissions to police, he changed his clothing when he arrived home and asked another member of his household to burn the garments he had worn during the attack. Then, despite having sustained injuries during the struggle with Aisling, she had fought back valiantly, leaving marks on her attacker. Puska traveled to his parents' home in Crumlin, Dublin, that same night. Security footage captured him and his parents exiting a car outside their apartment building at 12:58 in the morning on January 13th. As news of Aisling's murder spread, Ireland erupted in grief and outrage. Vigils were organized across the country, with hundreds of thousands of people gathering to remember Aisling, to mourn her loss, and to demand action to address violence against women. The murder had struck a nerve in Irish society, forcing conversations about women's safety, about the epidemic of male violence, about the reality that a young woman couldn't even exercise in broad daylight on a public path without being murdered. Aisling's death became a symbol of every woman's fear, the understanding that no amount of caution or common sense could guarantee safety from random male violence. Women across Ireland shared their experiences of being followed, harassed, threatened, of constantly calculating risk and modifying behavior to try to stay safe, of the exhausting reality that simply existing in public space as a woman carried inherent danger. The vigils were not just about mourning Aisling, but about channeling collective rage at a society that had normalized this violence, that had failed to protect women, that treated each murder as an isolated incident rather than part of a systemic problem. The investigation moved swiftly. On January 18th, 6 days after Aisling's murder, police arrested Josef Puska at St. James's Hospital in Dublin, where he was being treated for injuries he had sustained. In a stunning development, before police had even formally interviewed him, Puska confessed to a Garda officer at the hospital. He claimed he did not mean to hurt Aisling Murphy, that killing her was the result of panic. The confession took investigators by surprise, as they had attended the hospital to execute a warrant, not to conduct an interrogation. Puska was discharged from the hospital in the morning and immediately transported to Tullamore Garda Station, where officers obtained fingerprints, DNA samples, and blood samples. At 7:42 in the evening on January 19th, police formally charged Josef Puska with Aisling Murphy's murder. That same evening, he was brought before a special sitting of Tullamore District Court, where approximately 300 angry community members gathered outside, shouting as Gardaí escorted the accused killer to and from the courthouse. Members of Aisling's family appeared in court, holding up framed photographs of their beloved daughter and sister, ensuring that even in that procedural hearing, her presence and humanity were not forgotten. Puska was remanded in custody at Cloverhill Prison to await trial. The trial began on October 16, 2023, at Dublin's Central Criminal Court, nearly 2 years after Aisling's murder. It lasted just over 3 weeks, with more than 60 witnesses testifying and 13 days of evidence presented to the jury. The prosecution built a meticulous case using CCTV footage that tracked Puska's movements throughout the day, DNA evidence linking him to the crime scene, witness testimony from the women he had followed earlier in the afternoon, and statements from Jenna Stack and Aoife Marin describing what they had witnessed at the canal. Despite his hospital confession, Puska pleaded not guilty to murder. Speaking through a Slovakian interpreter, he offered a defense that prosecutors and observers alike found utterly unbelievable. He claimed that while cycling along the canal towpath, a man wearing dark clothing and a surgical mask had shouted at him, pushed him off his bike, and stabbed him 3 times in the abdomen. According to this version of events, Aisling Murphy had appeared on the scene and spoken to this mysterious attacker, who then stabbed her behind some bushes before running away toward the N52 flyover. Puska maintained he had been trying to help Aisling when the witnesses came upon them, explaining away his threatening behavior toward Jenna Stack and Aoife Marin as a misunderstanding. The prosecution systematically dismantled this story, presenting it as farcical and wholly inconsistent with the physical evidence. The DNA evidence was damning. Puska's DNA was found under Aisling's fingernails, evidence of her desperate struggle against him. His blood was on her body and clothing, and her blood was on him. The CCTV footage showed no mysterious attacker, only Puska following women throughout Tullamore that afternoon before arriving at the canal where Aisling was walking. Witnesses testified to what they had seen and heard, painting a clear picture of what had really happened. On November 9, 2023, after deliberating on the evidence, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty. Josef Puska was convicted of murdering Aisling Murphy. The courtroom erupted in emotion, with Aisling's family members weeping in relief that justice had been served, that the man who had taken their daughter from them had been held accountable. On November 16, 2023, dressed in a gray suit with a white shirt and no tie, Josef Puska stood before the court to receive his sentence. He made no comment and showed no reaction as the judge, speaking through a translator, handed down the mandatory term of life imprisonment. Under Irish law, a life sentence typically means a minimum of 12 years before eligibility for parole, though the severity of the crime and lack of remorse often result in far longer incarceration. But the case did not end with Puska's conviction. Investigators discovered that members of his family had actively worked to help him evade capture and destroy evidence. 2 of Puska's brothers, Lubomir Puska Jr. and Dezider Puska, along with their wives, Jana Grunzova and Sylvia Gaziova, were charged with offenses related to withholding information and destroying evidence. A 5th family member, Josef Puska Sr., Puska's father, was also charged. The charges revealed that immediately after the murder, Puska had returned home and told family members what he had done. Rather than reporting him to police, rather than thinking of Aisling Murphy's family desperate for answers, rather than considering that a murderer should not be free to potentially kill again, the Puska family chose loyalty to their own. They burned the clothing Josef had worn during the attack, destroying crucial evidence. They failed to inform authorities that he had returned home injured and had admitted to cutting a woman with a knife. They helped him travel to Dublin that night, facilitating his attempt to escape justice. In June 2025, 4 of the family members were found guilty of their respective charges. In October 2025, all 5 were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 20 months to 2.5 years. At the sentencing hearing, Amy Murphy delivered a powerful statement condemning the family's actions. She noted the bitter irony of defense attorneys highlighting the defendants' family values, how they had migrated to Ireland seeking a better future, supposedly valuing family and education. Yet their actions, she pointed out, starkly contradicted those principles. They had known one of their own had murdered Aisling in the most horrific way imaginable, and instead of doing the right thing, they had done everything possible to conceal what they knew, destroy evidence, and leave the Murphy family without justice or closure. Justice Caroline Biggs, in handing down the sentences, stated that the family's actions represented a collective decision to maintain silence and assist Puska in evading capture, all while knowing he had admitted to murdering Aisling Murphy. The judge acknowledged that while she must consider mitigating factors, the harm done to the Murphy family and to society by obstructing a murder investigation was profound. For the Murphy family, no verdict, no sentence, no amount of public support can restore what was taken from them on January 12, 2022. Aisling will never teach another class, never play another tune, never celebrate another birthday or holiday with her family, never marry or have children, never grow old. She was 23 years old, at the beginning of a life that should have stretched decades into the future, and all of that was stolen by a stranger who decided, for reasons that will never make sense, to commit murder on a winter afternoon. The case of Aisling Murphy stands as a testament to the senselessness of random violence, the vulnerability of women in public spaces, and the collective grief of a nation that lost a bright light far too soon. Her name is now synonymous with Ireland's ongoing struggle to address violence against women, a struggle that continues in courtrooms and parliaments, in vigils and protests, in the daily choices people make about how they treat one another, and whether they will stand by silently or speak up against injustice. Aisling Murphy's life mattered. Her death was a tragedy that should never have happened, and her memory endures in everyone determined to build a world where women can walk along a canal path on a Wednesday afternoon without fear.